Hey lads, today we have a really exciting game. This is the first World Chess Championship match between Johannes Zukertort and Wilhelm Steinitz. This was in 1886, the very first World Chess Championship. This match was 20 games, and today we're going to be looking at just one of those games. This was game 19, which was the decisive game. The reason they played 20 games, I don't know. It may just be they wanted a more round figure of, okay, the first World Chess Championship was 20 total games, but the 20th game was sort of just played for fun. Wilhelm Steinitz was leading in the match 9 wins to 5 wins. All of the games that had been drawn were just not counted. I kind of like this way of playing chess. It means that the players have to go for checkmate. And the first one to get 10 checkmates, that's the winner. I think in modern chess, there's a lot of draws and people don't like players playing safe. I think there are several really helpful things that we can actually learn from the way Steinitz played this game. And I think these are things that will really help you improve your chess. So I'm hoping that I can convey those things well today. So let's have a quick look and see what happened in game 19 of the first World Chess Championship match. Zukertort started with the move d4. Steinitz responded with d5, and Zukertort's next move was c4. c4 signifies the Queen's Gambit. This is the Queen's Gambit. A gambit is when you give up a pawn for quick, rapid development. The Queen's Gambit is honestly one of the only sound gambits in chess. All other gambits generally give white, if white's the one gambiting, they generally give white a worse position according to the engine. But the Queen's Gambit's a very solid one because even though you can capture this pawn for free, it's very hard to keep this pawn on c4 for the entirety of the game. If you try to protect it, you end up just placing your pieces on bad squares and you're not going to have as solid of a game. So these days, most people don't accept the gambit. And Steinitz, being a total gangster at chess, also didn't accept the pawn on c4. He instead played the very principled e6. Zukertort's next move is one you're probably accustomed to seeing. He put the knight on c3. And this is a move that I always, when I'm playing chess, I do it on move 2. The Job of London is d4, knight c3, and bishop f4. That's my first 3 moves in like 90% of my games. However, people think that the Job of London is a kind of dubious opening because the knight is blocking the pawn on c2. In this position, the pawn has already advanced, and so the knight comes behind the pawn. Generally, they say that it's good to push the pawn first and develop the knight behind the pawn. If the knight is behind a pawn, then it's doing a lot better. The reason for this is because the knight isn't attacked, right? It can't be attacked by a bishop here because there's a pawn blocking the bishop's threat, or maybe there's a rook here and is attacking. The pawn is defending the knight in a sense because it can't be attacked. But the knight, even though it's not attacked, it still is attacking because the knight is the only piece in chess that can jump over another piece. And so it can still see the square d5 here and see the square b5 here, even though there's a pawn in front of him. Steinitz responds with knight f6, and Zukertort puts his bishop on g5, pinning the knight to the queen, so this knight cannot move because then the queen gets eaten by the bishop. Steinitz responds with putting his bishop on e7, so now this knight can move. It is no longer pinned. White responds with knight f3, a simple developing move, and black castles. And it's this next move that is a questionable one. And Bobby Fischer actually said about this move that white plays a mistake already. He should just play e3 naturally. The next move should be this natural e3 move, solidifying this pawn chain. But white makes the move c5. I suppose he doesn't want an exchange here, and he thinks maybe he can get this pawn further into black's position and cause some stress. I actually hate when this pawn moves to c5. I often play the Caro-Kann, and when I play the Panov attack, often this pawn gets here and is protected, and I'm struggling to fight against it because it just blocks my pieces coming to good squares. It's very, very annoying. However, this was a slight inaccuracy, and Steinitz's response is very accurate. He plays b6, wanting to trade off this pawn. Zukertort responds with b4, defending this pawn, and Steinitz captures the pawn. Now, something in chess that a lot of people are taught, if you have a chess coach, you've probably been taught this. If you've played a lot of chess, you might have started to realize this. But if you have a decision to recapture a pawn, which one would you recapture with here? A good rule in chess to remember is always capture towards the center. Now, the center of the board is over here, and we want to not take away from the center. We want to go into the center. So we should really capture b takes c5 in this position because we're closer to the center. The center is something that we're going to be looking at in this game specifically. But Zukertort did not capture towards the center here. He played the move d takes c5, and his position is a lot worse already. Steinitz responds to this little pawn chain by attacking the base of the pawn chain. The base of a pawn chain is the pawn that is protecting all the other pawns and is not protected by other pawns. So if you see this pawn chain here, the base is the square f7. So for this little pawn chain, the pawn chain base is b4. How do we attack the base of this pawn chain? Well, there's one move that works, and that is the move that Steinitz played, a5. a5 is attacking this one, and so if this one captures here, well, we could then capture here, and then we could probably pick up the pawn on a5 after and be up a pawn. We've given one pawn, and we're capturing two back. So how does Zukertort defend against this threat? He just extends the base of the pawn chain. He plays the move a3. Now the base of the pawn chain is all the way over here, and if we were to capture here, he could recapture, have his pawn chain here still, and also be attacking the rook. So probably rook captures, queen captures, and white's got these two pawns that are going to probably cause quite a bit of damage in this game. We can no longer attack the base very easily. Now maybe there's moves like putting the knight here or putting the knight here and going after it, but probably white can defend it with a knight back or the queen up and be doing okay. The next move by Steinitz, according to Bobby Fischer, wins Steinitz the game. And if you look at this position, I'd be hard-pressed to find a move that really wins the game. But Bobby Fischer says this is the fantastic move in this game, and it's the winning move. What move would you play as black? Honestly, it's quite tricky. Maybe you would say develop a knight. It's always good to develop pieces. Maybe you would say h6, kick this bishop away. Maybe you would say put the knight on e4, get a knight into the center, and then we're also attacking this bishop. We're attacking it twice. So the bishop will have to take, we have to take, they would take, we would take, our pawns are doubled. Nah, it's not so obvious, is it? The move that Steinitz played is quite deep. Let me show you. He plays d4. Now, why can this piece not be captured? There's two pieces looking at this pawn, and it's only defended by the queen. So it kind of looks like it's a free pawn. If I was playing this game online or against someone, even over the board where I have a lot of time to think, I'm probably not going to find this move because it's not natural to just put a piece into the enemy camp and leave it undefended. But let's have a quick look and see what would have happened if white took this pawn. We cannot capture that knight because then they eat our queen. But what we can do instead is capture this pawn on b4. So white's gotten a pawn, and now we've gotten a pawn back. So it's equal. But let's continue this line. A takes b4. White is now up another pawn. Black takes the rook. White has to take the rook back. And now we can capture the knight on d4. So we've lost a pawn, but we've won a knight. So this is actually a very good exchange for black, and the sequence of moves is kind of tricky to spot, but this is why white should not be capturing that pawn. Now obviously Zukertort was a bit of a genius. He's playing in the World Chess Championship. He's got to be pretty smart. He looks at all those lines and he decides, I'm not going to take the pawn. So let's go back and see what move does he play instead. Instead of moving his knight away, he takes the knight on f6. So now we have a choice. Do we take this knight on c3? Probably not, because if we take here, then the bishop captures the pawn, and now white's just up a clean pawn. So in this position, Steinitz didn't capture the knight on c3. He instead decides to capture this bishop. Now, when I was looking at this game, and I was flicking through the moves initially, and thinking about everything that happened, it all seemed to make a lot of sense. But this next move really confused me. I'm pretty sure like 95% of us are going to recapture this bishop with the bishop, because we want our bishop on an active square. We want it to be, defending this pawn. It just looks really nice on this square. And also, why would you capture with the g pawn? That opens up your king. Now this file is open and pieces can maybe get over here and check the king. We want to keep our pawns intact in front of our king. Like, why would we do this? This is why Steinitz was a world chess champion. And I think this move is one of the best moves in the game. He captures that bishop with the g pawn. G takes f6. And the idea for why he captured that pawn revolves completely around controlling the center of the board. He now has a pawn on f6, and he's able to play e5, and he's got a pawn on d4. And these three pawns are completely controlling the center squares of the board, and he's going to use this central control to have a big time advantage and a big time attack. So let's have a look and see how he does this. Zukertort sees the position. He sees his knight is still in danger, and so he decides, I'm going to move that knight. And Steinitz responds by solidifying his center, playing e5. The pawns are all together, and things are looking very good for him. Here, white wants to get a bit of counterplay, so he plays the move b5, pushing this pawn forwards, and black responds by, instead of worrying about this, he develops a piece. He puts his bishop on e6. g3 happens, trying to find a square for this bishop of white's, and maybe white wants to castle and get his king to safety. Steinitz attacks the queenside pawns by playing c6. Now, Zukertort has a couple responses that he can go for. He can take the pawn on c6, or he can push the pawn. Let's say Zukertort plays the move b6, which is apparently the best move in the position. Black could respond by putting his knight on a6, attacking this weak pawn. He wants to attack the base of the pawn chain, and the base of the pawn chain is now the pawn c5. So we have two pieces attacking, and there's only one defender from white. So the only response by white is to get another defender in. Putting the rook on c1, now defending. Queen d5. We now have three attackers on the base of the pawn chain. How does white respond? Can white respond in any good way where they defend this pawn again? You might say, oh, queen c2. Queen c2 means we now have three defenders of this pawn. But queen c2 blunders because of a sneaky sort of attack. We actually can play the move e4. The knight has to move somewhere. Let's say it goes to h4. And then we can attack the queen. They can take our pawn. We can take them. But this recapture here shows that we are now looking at the rook on h1. And so, yeah, maybe the bishop could come here because the knight's defending it. But here we could just check on e5 and then pick this queen up on the next move. So king f1, and then we take the queen. So that would be a terrible blunder to try to defend this pawn. So if you can't defend the pawn on c2, you might have to find a tricky move like bishop g2, where maybe the knight could come to h4 and defend the g2 bishop, and the g2 bishop could attack the queen. But this would just give up the pawn. So here the knight could take on c5. Maybe this knight takes the knight back. We could recapture here. They can't capture our bishop because we win the rook. And the rook is 5 points, the bishop's only 3. But here maybe they go knight h4. We could either block the bishop by playing e4, or we could just pull back to d6 and defend our own bishop. Both moves are equally good, and black is just up a clean pawn here. I think all of these moves and continuations here are very logical, and so Zukertort probably thought through all these moves. And so instead of deciding to push the pawn to b6, we can go back and see what did he do instead of pushing this pawn. He did the other option. He took the pawn on c6. The pawn's been captured. Black wants to recapture, so he develops his knight and he recaptures that pawn. White fianchettos his bishop, putting it on this long diagonal and getting ready to castle his king. And black plays the move rook b8 with a very sneaky threat. Pause the video and see if you can spot what does this move threaten. The move that it threatens here is bishop to b3. And bishop on b3 attacks the queen and attacks the knight. This is called a fork, where you attack two pieces with one piece. And he can now put the bishop here because the rook is defending the bishop. So white sees this and responds by getting out of this danger. He just moves his queen over. The queen's a little stronger on this diagonal. Maybe it can come over to h6. It's also defending the pawn on c5. And so this seems quite reasonable. Now we get to see how Steinitz uses the central control to his advantage and really push for victory. He plays the move d3. If you were to capture this pawn with white, you would be in a big world of trouble. Let's say you capture. We could go queen captures d3. And now the queen is looking at the f1 square. And so white cannot castle. Let's say white decided to bring their bishop back to attack the queen. We could just take the knight here. The knight's not defended. Let's say that a knight comes here to c3 to get ready to defend and put the knight in the way. We could just put the rook on b3. Now we have two attackers on this knight. Maybe the knight goes over to e2. And now we could play bishop to g4, attacking this square 3 times. Everything's just falling apart for white. So capturing this pawn would have been a terrible decision, which is why Zukertort did not capture that pawn. Instead, Zukertort plays the move pawn to e3. Steinitz has a pawn in the center. It's not defended by another pawn, so he just advances to e4, defending that central pawn. Steinitz's control of the central pawns is fantastic this game, and this is why it's such an interesting game. Here, white's knight is attacked, so he moves his knight back and attacks the base of the pawn chain with 2 pieces. How can you defend a piece that is attacked twice? You only have 1 move to defend it. If you tried to defend with the bishop, the knight could take the pawn, you could take the knight, the bishop could take you, and white's just won a clean pawn, and now the second pawn is probably more likely to fall because there's no pawn defending it. But here, Steinitz just plays f5, and he can play f5 because he has a pawn on f6. If he had played f6 earlier, he wouldn't have had a pawn on f6 to play to f5. So he has this beautiful central control because of this original recapture of g takes f6. He knew that the way that he was going to attack and win this game was having strong central control. White castles, gets out of danger, doesn't want to be near any of these nasty pawns. And look at what these pawns are doing to this bishop. This bishop cannot move. It can come over to h3, but what's it going to do on h3? Like, it's just stuck. And look at black's bishop. It's got this whole diagonal that it's looking at. It can even come back and route around. This is called a spatial advantage. This is one of the common imbalances in chess that you can get. If you have more space on one side of the board, you have the advantage of being able to move around, maneuver your pieces onto better squares. Here, white's just stuck defending, and he's got a useless bishop on g2 that's going to be useless for the entire game. Now it's time for Steinitz to play. What's he going to do? I think often in chess, when you're sitting in the middle game, you've already developed your pieces and you sort of moved some pawns and you've done some stuff. You might just be sitting there thinking, what's the next plan? I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here. Well, one helpful thing that you can try to do is look at your pieces and say, where is this piece best placed? You could look at maybe this rook and you say, where does this rook want to be? If I had this rook over here on c2, that would be fantastic. Or maybe you look at this knight and you're like, oh, the knight, it would be beautiful if it was sitting on e2, checking the king and the queen. So you want to look at where your pieces are best placed and try to get your pieces to those squares. In this position, black has a good bishop. He's got another good bishop here. His knight's okay. Maybe his knight could deserve to come over to e5 and then maybe over to f3, or maybe it could come over to g4. So maybe his knight could be a wee bit better placed, but the knight is actually serving a good function here. What it's doing right now is blockading this pawn. This pawn cannot try to push and promote, which would be something that Zukertort probably wants to do. The rook here is looking down the open file. It's perfectly placed. Maybe the queen could come to c7 and then the knight could move and they could attack this pawn. Maybe the knight could then come back to d7 and have 2 attackers, 3 attackers with the bishop. So that might be an idea, queen c7. The move that Steinitz plays is a very solid move. He plays rook to e8. Now you might be thinking, how is this rook any better on e8 than f8? Well, the e8 file is probably going to be a better file than f8. And the sole reason for that is on f8, it's looking at a pawn, and then the next piece on the file is another pawn. So he's got 2 pawns that are in the way. In this file, he's only got 1 pawn in the way, and it's very likely that some pieces are going to come off here eventually, and the 2 bishops are probably going to move. So this rook is probably going to get fairly active on this file. Now, it's not the greatest move. I think the engine actually recommended knight e5 is slightly better. It improves the knight slightly. And the second best move, which was very similar to this move, was queen c7. So there's a couple moves that he could have played. But rook e8 is a very solid move. Fischer actually talks about this move. He says, a very modern move, a quiet positional move. The rook is doing nothing now, but later. And Fischer implied that the rook's probably going to have a lot of influence on this game shortly to come. Now, Fischer also talks about the next move for white, and it's very hard here to know exactly what to do as white. The engine actually recommends the move g4 is the best move for white, which is not a very intuitive move to play. It's moving a pawn in front of the king. The king's going to be exposed and weaker. Maybe the bishop can come here now and the queen can come here and start grabbing stuff and attacking this bishop. And this bishop can come over to h3 eventually and go for checkmate. It just does not look good. I would never play g4. And I can totally understand why Zukertort didn't play g4. But the move that he does go for is f3. And Fischer says, this is to break up the center. It's his only chance. And if Fischer says that, I'm just going to believe it. Now that white has played the move f3, there's a beautiful tactic that Steinitz can play. And Steinitz finds the tactic. Now, when you're looking for tactics, one way you can find them is look at your opponent's pieces and say which piece is not defended. Because often in chess, there are pieces that are not defended. It's always good to try to look at pieces on your opponent's board at any point in the game and say, are there any that aren't defended? There's probably some tactics that I can look for. Now, if you look at the pieces, the bishop and the rook are defended by the king. The knight's defended by the queen. The rook and the queen and the rook all defend each other. But this knight over here on a4 is not defended. So there's some tactics. Pause the video and see if you can find the move that Steinitz played. Maybe you are as smart as Steinitz. Now's your time to show it. The move that Steinitz played was knight to d4. A brilliant move. And Zukertort probably calculated some of this and saw, well, he kind of has to take the knight because what's being threatened right now is knight to e2. Checking the king, checking the queen. The engine actually says the best move for white is to go king h1, so that when the knight comes in here to this square that it wants to be on, remember we said earlier, where's the knight best placed? Well, the square e2 would be fantastic. If it's placed here, I mean, the game's basically over. It's just looking deadly. But he decides to capture. And you can see now Steinitz can come grab that pawn, and he's given up a knight for a pawn, but he's checking the king, and he's also attacking this knight on a4. And here, white can either block with the rook or move the king. He decides to go for the best move, moving the king, and black can capture the knight back. But is that what you want to do in a game of chess? The answer is no. You don't want to just take free points. You want to push your advantage and go for checkmate. So what does black do instead? He plays the move e3. And e3 is a beautiful move because, yes, he's attacking this knight, but now he's also attacking this knight. And look at the squares this knight can go to. e4, c4, b3, and b1. They're all bad. They're all completely losing. If he goes here, we can eat it with a pawn. If he goes here, we can eat it with a bishop or a queen. If he goes here, we can eat it with the rook. And if he goes here to b1, well, that just lets us eat the rook on a1. Every single move is terrible. So instead of trying to move this knight out of the way, he plays the move knight to c3. This move blocks the queens looking at this rook. And now maybe this knight can jump back to here and defend this one. Not a great move, but not a bad move considering the position you're in. Now I want to talk about something super important in chess. You've probably all heard that you should develop your pieces. And we always think of developing our pieces in the opening. But this is something true at all stages of the game. And I think this is something that I've just learned recently. If you develop your pieces at all stages of the game, always get all your pieces as active as they can be. You're going to have just much better, much more beautiful chess. In this position, yes, black could just win a knight. But he plays the very beautiful move, bishop to f6. And what he does with this move is he develops a bishop. Now this bishop, it was looking at a pawn, but now it's looking at this knight. This knight is not defended. And this knight is not defended. How does white respond to this? He moves one of his pieces out of danger and he defends the other one. Okay, so it looks like white is controlling. White is doing well. But now that he's moved his knight off this square, we can put a pawn onto that square. d2. Steinitz is pushing his center all the way to the edge of the board. He's going to get two queens. How do you deal with this as white? You just try to move your queen out of danger. He put his queen on c2. And now what do you do as black? Develop. If you said push another pawn or something, you're wrong. Develop your pieces. Always develop your pieces. This queen can be tempoed. How can we tempo this queen? Tempo means attack that piece and make it move again. Bishop to b3. Attacking the queen. The queen has to move again. And even though we're just attacking the queen with this bishop, we're also doing something else. We're enabling this rook that we placed on e8 to be involved in the game. It is now looking at this pawn, and this pawn is going to push. Steinitz has his pieces where he wants them because he took the time in the earlier stages of the game to place his pieces on better squares. Now it's paying off for him. This white queen has to move. And where can it go? It's only got one square. I mean, maybe it could come to b2, but that looks terrible because we could just go bishop c4, attack the rook, and also attack the queen with our own rook. That looks really bad. He decides to move it to f5, capture a pawn. Cool, he got a pawn. Now what do? We have a bishop on b3, and b3 is protecting the d1 square. And so we've got another defender of this square. Our queen's also defending this square. So we are ready to promote. We promote to a queen. They take, we take, and here, if white takes this bishop, it's checkmate in 2. Check, bishop has to block, queen checkmate, looking at all the squares. So he just can't take this bishop. Here he plays the move knight to c3, attacking the bishop. He's kind of just going all out. If we take this knight, then the rook can take the bishop, and maybe white's surviving here, but black plays the beautiful, quiet, and slow move e2, defending the bishop with the pawn. Everything's looking very good. White captures the bishop. And now, what would you play as black? Black simply captures the free knight. And he's still got this fork on both rooks. One of those rooks is going to die. There's no good checks for white here. He could try to go here, but the king just goes to h8 and is completely safe, not going to get touched anymore. This threat is too dangerous. It was actually in this position after this capture that Zukertort resigned. What a beautiful game. Because of this game, Steinitz became the first world chess champion. Lads, if you enjoyed my covering of this game, leave in the comments a game that you want me to go over, and I'll do it in one of the following videos in this series. I'll come out with a memorable game every single Monday. I hope you liked the video. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of it. I'm not very good at analyzing games. I'm not the greatest chess player, but I am trying to improve at my chess, and I think this series is really helping me. I hope it's helping you too. See you lads very soon.